Anytime.
Okay.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, right. Thank you everyone for coming out today on the 25th of October 2018. This is the Michigan State University African Studies Center Eye on Africa series. And we are privileged today to have with us Dr. David Coplan to be giving a paper. Dr. David Coplan is an emeritus professor of social anthropology at the University of The Witwatersrand, or WITS, in South Africa. He has had a long and productive career as an anthropologist studying South Africa, Lesotho, and the lives of the migrant populations of the region. His classic 1986 book, In Township Tonight, South Africa's Black City Music and Theater, on obviously music and theater during the apartheid era, is still widely read today and is in fact on its second edition. His other noted book is from 1994, In the Time of Cannibals, the word music of South Africa's Basotho migrants. Additionally, he made the film Songs of the Adventurers in 1986. He's also written extensively for the popular press and a general readership beyond academic publishing. In recent years, he has written extensively on the history, culture, and meanings of the border between Lesotho and South Africa from the perspective of Basotho who inhabit the border districts. This work has led him to be at the forefront of African Borderlands studies, and he edited a special issue of the Journal of Borderlands Studies in 2010, calling for more scholarship on the idea of borders in Africa. This, of course, is his topic here today as part of the Eye on Africa series. His talk is entitled Africa in Border and Borderlands Theory. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. David Coplan.
Thanks very much, John. The field of African borderlands studies has two important vectors or dimensions that I hope we'll discuss. The one, of course, is what takes place at African borders, the borders between African states, and how that dynamism is and how it's, of course, been changing as the politics evolve. But the other and more recent, and I think, unfortunately, more powerful vector is external interference. Maybe it's a bit a harsh word, but certainly external influence and activity about African borders, especially coming from the European Union, and to do with the wave of migration, largely unwanted, migration from Africa up into across the Mediterranean and into the EU, such that I've kind of combined a couple of papers to try and give an equal valence to these two things, because you can talk about Africa's border with Europe, and people say, well, what would that be? Would that be Tel Aviv or what? Well, it's the Mediterranean. That's the Africa's border with Europe, and is it ever our borderland? So, because there's water there, and quite a bit of it, doesn't mean that the encounter between African migrants and the countries they come from, the sides they come from, and the receiving countries isn't a vital issue of our times. And before I go into my actual paper, but I mean, of course, tragically to say, can't turn on the TV without seeing African people. Maybe there's an impression that it's all from the Middle East, or they've got to be Syrians, or they're, I don't know, Afghans, or Iraqis, or they're what. I want to say a very large proportion of the people who are suffering and being injured and even drowning, and then continuing, of course, to suffer after the event of being plucked out of the water, if they are African people from those countries. And this has led to very forceful, the term I'll use, which I'll get to later in my paper, is externalization of European borders into Africa, where, you know, I just said Africa's border is, with Europe, is the Mediterranean, but it can be Dakar, or Tripoli, or what have you, all right? Wherever there's a presence. Okay, so I'm going to start with some background of the work that kind of all got us going around the turn of the century to set the scene, because I don't know if everybody's read all this literature about the African borders and how it works and so on, and then move into a discussion, I hope, where there may be some of you who know, who've visited border areas recently, or followed the situation more closely, who may know more than I do, because I don't get around to all these border areas all the time. Now, besides, I live down in Johannesburg, the bottom of the world. Some people say, well, all the Zimbabweans are running to South Africa, and what are we going to do in this? And we're going to have, and I say, yes. And when Zimbabwe happens to us, where are we going to run? Because south of us is like penguins. You know, there's just no, sorry, there is no South Africa for us to run to. We're already in it. Okay. And then people realize, oh my gosh. Okay. Both border theory and indeed border studies as a field owe their cross-disciplinary origins in development to scholars of the American Southwest. By the late 1990s, spurred by the rapid development of the European Union, Europeanist scholars had begun to contribute not only a wealth of empirical studies, but also significant theoretical insights and concepts to border studies. Africa and other regions of the world formerly known as Third, thank you, Prince, that day, we trust, is long past when we, the North, were theory and they, the South, were data. Many years ago, pioneers such as Anthony Asiwaju, my great mentor, and Paul Nugent, another mentor, Ajomo Adeniyi, C.S. Momo, Jegunjibe, and others, were already making contributions to border theory that are difficult to supersede today. Still, African border studies have suffered from some particular disadvantages. The seeming friability of African national states and their lack of a popularly rooted social identity or morality have been coupled with the notorious porousness or negotiability of their borders. These borders were in any case conceived, not always accurately, as arbitrary divisions in the midst of powerfully self-identified pre-colonial polities or language groups. Such conceptions have helped to keep African borders on the scholarly as well as political periphery. If one thinks about it, these very realities and contradictions ought to have motivated greater attention to the goings-on along African borders and not less. Not surprisingly, the intensity of activity that characterizes these border districts, and indeed the dynamics of African state development itself, in time came to the notice of a range of talented Africanists from Europe, North America, and Africa itself. In many cases, these researchers had chosen to locate their fieldwork in areas near or within local borderlands in pursuit of projects that they thought were quite unrelated to this geopolitical reality. But then the festive bustle and demi-monde enterprise they encountered upon every crossing to visit a border post led them to realize that this was where some of the most revealing and important forms of social and economic transaction were taking place. As a result, not a few Africanists who have studied borders, or more often their border, have done so by default, lured away from the calm of less transient interior communities by the mobile and shadowy attractions of sovereignty's Klieg-lit stage. I hope I'm being clear here that some of the early pioneers were people who went to an area and didn't really intend to study borders, but then they had to cross those borders. And it was carnival time. I mean, those places were so full of social activity and different kinds of people and social, examples of things and things going on. They said, oh, well, never mind my quiet little village. I think I'll hang out here by the border post and see what's cooking. And that's the beginning of African border studies. Okay. Yet another result of this situation has been a rather myopic empirical focus on one's own border as a case, to the detriment of comparative or more broadly conceptual and theoretical studies. In this regard, I think I'm going to skip that. In June 1907, a first step in this direction was taken at the workshop on African Borderlands research, emerging agendas and critical reflections at the African Studies Centre at the University of Edinburgh. There, the African Borderland Research Network, it's called ABORN, was found by the 15 participants as an interdisciplinary network of European, American, and African scholars who seek to integrate history, anthropology, development, migration, and refugee studies in a broad field of African border research. In July 2008, the second ABORN conference was held in Bayreuth in Germany and featured not only formal papers but 3 workshops, including one focusing on the imperative to combine empirical case studies with a more conceptual and theoretical approach, providing a distinctive scientific profile of borderland studies by developing theoretical perspectives and methodologies based on African research findings. To begin at the beginning, we might review a few comparative axes along which African borders might provide a contrasting or alternative ground for research. These include such well-worn observations that while borders are nowhere simply the product of geography, borders in North America and Europe were established by war, domination, and resistance, while in Africa they are thought to be the arbitrary product of the 1885 Berlin Conference. Several scholars, such as Simon Katzenellenbogen, have to say in his essay, It Didn't Happen in Berlin, note that there were many other boundary-making processes and events, and territorial claims were not, in fact, recognized based on effective occupation, as specified in the conference's final act. People aware there's the 1885 conference, which is this big thing that's supposed to happen. Not very much actually happened there, it turns out. It was in the aftermath of the implications of what was supposedly decided there, but then worked out on the ground between the imperial actors. So this big marquee, 1885, it's not really quite what it's supposed to be. More significantly, almost 40% of colonial boundary lines had some pre-existing political reality. Strasaldo points out, conversely, that all boundaries are in some sense artificial, and that African boundaries are in no way more artificial than European or other boundaries. Yet the most important reality of all, as so many of the have said, is that whether originally arbitrary or not, and intra-ethnically or politically divisive or not, African borders are often now an accepted, even actively reproduced ground of social and economic life for borderlanders. And as a famous pioneer scholar, Donna Flynn, observed, less thoroughly explored are the ways in which arbitrary African borders have become entrenched and embedded in local communities that surround them. How is it that populations that had an internal border imposed on them cannot now imagine their existence without it? How are borders perceived by these continually crossing them as corridors of opportunity rather than as divisions or barriers? And so it's always been fine to say, Africa must unite, except that would spoil my business. So let's think about that for a while. Okay. Having established that African borders were most often established by colonial competition, interacting with indigenous contexts on the ground, their study is powerfully influenced by some essential realities that follow. First, the history of border making itself has present relevance. In Africa, this has usually to do with the historical construction of ethnic identities in relation to territorial claims. Second, newly independent African governments did not inherit functioning colonial states, but only extractive administrations, out of which, as Julius Nyerere recognized, they were compelled to attempt to build, with mixed success, post-colonial nations. Just quickly, the African countries at the start, when they were, abracadabra, voila, as an African country, weren't countries. They were colonial administrative apparatus, not really rooted in the structural political life of the populations that were within their borders. And the African leaders, whom we love to pillory and to criticize, had to make something like countries out of them, okay, despite whatever someone wished to say. Anyway, the OAU, the African Unity, Organization of African Unity's famous glass houses rule, mandating the acceptance of boundaries at independence, was part of this compulsion. Second, neocolonial powers, for whom globalization is the latest instrumentality, have repeatedly attempted to reinstate imperial economic regimes. Third, concentrating power and wealth in the capital's public sector causes instability, so that most African wars are internal to state borders, in unstable states. Unfortunately, these conflicts often spill over state borders, necessitating multi-state cross-border cooperation, even beyond the continent. Fourth, the stability of African states can be enhanced by recognizing areas of regional self-production and the centrality and transnational utility of the border. Another point I haven't really written here, but it has been asked, why did the African nationalist leaders who were in a position to be in the forefront, to be the inheritors of the new African states, why did they agree to it? I mean, you know that the country that France or Britain is, quote, giving you to rule is not a governable national identity structure. And the answer is they took what they thought they could get given. They were told, well, this is what there is. And not unsurprisingly, politicians said, so you're going to give me this to rule, but it's not really very governable. Well, take it or leave it. All right, I'll take it. And thereby hangs something of a tale. Okay. There are many characteristics of border management, border life, and borderlanders that operate at borders everywhere, to which African borders are no exceptions, and that indeed inform the comparative and analytical foundations of border theory. But I'd like to focus on African borders that not uniquely, at least greatly, exhibit and contribute to these foundations. So while, for example, the performance, without necessarily the substance of sovereignty and control, is a high-profile feature of any border post, it is particularly salient at African borders where the substance may exist in inverse relation to the performance of the state. Again, there is the degree, rather than the mere reality, to which attempts to increase regulation at African borders fail to improve enforcement, sometimes intentionally, but rather simply add to the opportunities to exact payment for yet another level of circumvention. In this regard, it is not surprising that what we might term mixed inefficiency or inconsistent enforcement, this is a great principle of African border management, is enforce things, but not too much. Okay. And they are the order of the day. In many ways, the border posts themselves are a form of business, of the market producing the mode of operation. According to these principles, if the posts were adequately staffed, resourced, and technologically controlled, there would be far less opportunity to contravene regulations for a price. Conversely, if passport controls were greatly relaxed or withdrawn, there would be no reason to pay cash for the service. A system of illegal payments depends upon controls that are just inefficient and inconvenient enough to encourage payment to circumvent them. And this is indeed the form of operation everywhere in place. Okay? Isn't it unusual? All African borders are semi-efficient, precisely for that reason. Okay? Not too much and not too little. Further, inconsistent enforcement encourages many travelers who do not possess or have failed to carry the required documents and permits to try their luck at crossing without them. This ensures that when officials do spot check or slow down ordinary operations to inconsistently enforce regulations, they will catch a far higher percentage of violators than if such enforcement were regularly anticipated. Such violators serve as well the purpose of sacrificial lambs, punished to demonstrate to travelers who pay to circumvent procedures just what it is they are paying for. So yes, you want to spot check, but not in a regular way that people can anticipate. It should be unpredictable so you can catch some poor sheep who thought, well, gosh, I got here, I don't have my passport, but they usually don't check, or they haven't checked in a week and a half or something. Boof. All right? And then everybody says, oh, you? Yeah. And, well, I better go back and get my passport, whatever you have to do. So that's what they do. Another relationship key to how African borders and borderlanders operate is that between center and margin. For most African governments, central nation building is more important than incorporating borderlands and borderlanders, who experience central authority as oppressive. This is because national officials do not begin from the perspective of the border region itself, but rather make proposals that always negotiate national interess. But spatial justice requires that border people not be handicapped in their daily lives by their location. And as Samuel Truitt writes, border people are not blank slates for the inscription of new national identities. African borderlanders typically constitute their own cross-border society and do not emphasize their citizenship of either state. So as Donan and Wilson observe, border subjects produce their own border theory, rooted in social practice, and one that dismantles the conventional imaginary of the state and claims citizenships that transcend boundaries. Yet no African country, in contrast to Mexico or some others, has authorized dual nationality for their citizens, despite the impossibility of preventing it. Actually, there is a Lesotho, the place I work, has finally bit the bullet just recently and said, well, you can be a citizen of South Africa as well as Lesotho, which is more or less recognizing what the story is anyway. And because, of course, they've been busy penalizing people for this dual citizen, you might wonder, why give up this nice little source of... And the reason is just to encourage people to come back. I mean, it's reached a point where, okay, if you're going to be like that, I'll never come to Lesotho again, and I'll never buy any petrol, or I won't, you know, because successful Basotho in South Africa, who've done well there, they have a certain attachment, like Mexican people, to their home country. And as life goes on, they may think, well, let me improve the farm, let me rebuild my old school or something. Well, if you're going to, you know, give them such a hard time every time, they're going to find, well, you know, I'll build up my house in Lesotho and I'll build my house in South Africa, and my house in the Lesotho village can go rack and ruin. I don't care. You people, you know, you don't want me, you won't have me. So they've, you know, there are too many half-built houses and unplowed fields and half-finished businesses in Lesotho that were started by well-intentioned Basotho who've gone, you know, can keep it. So now they don't do that. And it makes some sense. Regardless, cross-border families are the norm, and migrant family members, including those of border officials, span the border and provide a base for common operations. At a busy border post, such as that at Lesotho's Maseru Bridge, it is a clear indication of advanced cross-border social integration. But such intensity of interaction, even when at Maseru Bridge it's strongly asymmetrical, does not erase borders. Typically, there is more business among African borderlanders and between them and the US and Europe than with their own interior. And communications and transport are better between twin towns on either side than with the next major settlement up or down the border. This is true of US-Mexico as well. Anybody been to Laredo, New Laredo? I mean, this is where the business is. Okay. The twin towns also feature periodic markets on both sides of the border to exchange goods, border warehouses, where large quantities of goods are stored in clusters of towns at the main points of passage across the border. The national government is therefore viewed there as parasitic, a kind of contemporary colonial power. Borderlanders in Africa demonstrate a growing distrust and suspicion of government, the interests of which are perceived as being opposed to border interests, and that regularly infringe on the economic and political freedoms of border residents. Indeed, one may ask what or whom in Africa do borders protect the citizenry from? Or is it only the government that's protected? Smuggling, which often enough takes on an open and festive atmosphere at African borders, is after all only a crime against the state and a response to taxation for which no services are provided in return. What do you get for your customs duty from the government? In contexts where the authority and the economy of the two bordering states are of equal weakness, the emphasis is on performance, not control, gatekeeping and taxation, not service. In Africa, borderlanders have greater self-justification than elsewhere to identify with each other, to create a common border identity, and to work to outwit the state. And I'm fond of Tony Asawaju's quotation, you know, smuggler, about smuggling, and you often hear, there's nothing like an African government official railing against, you know, the smugglers, who are ordinary citizens trying to make a living. But Tony says, the definition of a smuggler is someone who breaks the laws of the state in order to obey those of economics. Well, anyway. Borderlands create a border culture as well, a landscape that emerges from and transcends the history of political boundary making defined by the social actions from which it is built up. Borders are constructed by much more than the institutions of the state which are present there, of which the borders framework is a representative part. More than idealized locations for the instantiation of or performance of the state under the gaze of its other, borders are also meaning-making and meaning-carrying entities, parts of cultural landscapes which often transcend the physical limits of the state and defy the power of state institutions. For border residents, such cultures constitute waves of life and forms of meaning, which they share only or principally with other borderlanders or on the same side of the legal state demarcation. Still, I am concerned that, as Donan and Wilson have noted, culture is the least studied and least understood aspect of the structures and functions of international borders. Although scholars in a variety of fields have recognized the role of culture in the creation and maintenance of borders and borderlanders, few have directly tied culture to their analyses of statecraft at, across, and the result of borders. But if the border possesses a transnational identity of its own, it is one that has no stability as a cultural marker. National identity in Africa is a political and economic matter. There is no customs station for customs. But just to say that some people act as if they belong to, that the borderland is their country, and their compatriots, their fellow countrymen, are the guys on the other side of the border, not the guys back in the capital of the country. Borders facilitate cultural exchange just as they equilibrate the disparities of value of commercial exchange, disparities that are reflected in culture and in social contestation. The economic equality that characterizes both sides of so many African borders make for a border identity quite solid and not shifting and hysterical as in inequitable situations like that of Mexico and the United States. So Africa is a leader in the denationalization of identities because African nationality has been deterritorialized. Nationalism and its fictions are bankrupt, and they cannot erase or assimilate local identities, which are everywhere increasingly self-constructed. In many senses, therefore, the border becomes less a boundary dividing them into two nations than a bridge linking them in mutual dependence. As Finn explains, by centralizing their marginality in their economic strategies and through common border experience, African borderlanders have constructed a strong transnational identity around their sense of deep territorialization in the borderland. In a very literal sense, locals embody the border. They conceive of their cluster of border communities as constituting the international boundary. The border is not merely an arbitrary line dividing two nations. It is a social grouping based on historical and residential claims to the region. In other words, the border exists where notions of deep placement meet cross-border exchange and all its surrounding social, political, and economic relations. Even so, communities living in a binational space are not homogenized. As a Gambian, whose country is all borderlands, once explained to me, he said, Wolof, I asked him, I said, Gambia is like this little strip of ribbon smack in the middle of Senegal, which might not matter, except you all speak, Malinke and Wolof and Mande and so on. So why don't you fellows, become Senegambia or something? And he said to me, oh no, our Wolof brothers in Senegal are French. We are English. We cannot join with them. So that's how it works. Anyway, just to finish up here, quickly, on this part. I just wanted to mention before I moved on to conclude this section, a friend of mine named Ana Roque, who works in Lisbon, Portugal, and basically writes in Portuguese, and so a lot of people wouldn't know her work. But there is an archive of Portuguese colonial maps that she looks after in Lisbon, in a little institute, and they never have any money. But I went there, and she sent me some. They hired, when they demarcated the border between Mozambique and South Africa. First of all, part of the reason for where the demarcation is where there were animals to hunt at the time, because the Transvaal officials, the Afrikaners, they said, well, we're not going to ride for 2 weeks through the African bush where there's no animals to hunt or something, so the trek's got to go where we can shoot some game. So the border of Mozambique and South Africa, up where the old Transvaal Republic is based on where you can hunt. Okay, interesting sidelight. In any case, they hired somebody. In those days there were these artists or draftsmen who because this is at 18, and getting all the camera equipment and this and that into that part of the world, and so they had people who drew, and the drawings of that border and its features are beautiful. They're like works of art, and I've used them in teaching with students many times about African cartography and how the border area was represented. So I recommend corresponding with her. Anyway, just wanted to put in a plug for someone I care about and whose work I care about a lot. Tim Metlinsky is a younger scholar, an important new American voice in the field, observes that the majority of studies of African borders, my own work excepted, focus on the lives of borderlanders rather than on the border itself and how it functions in the lives of longer distance migrants and travelers. In his article, based on ethnographic evidence gathered at 23 international border crossings between 4 West African countries, he offers as well observations on the differences between West African borders and the U.S.-Mexico case, paradigmatic in border studies. Metlinsky posits that borders are negotiations in which border crossers engage and succeed differently based on their social positioning. Joining him in exploring the Africa, in this case South Africa, Lesotho, U.S.-Mexico comparison, my own work is based on the reality that these are 2 of the only borders in the world where vastly different levels of development meet. If hinged on this variable, the door to comparison of 2 such distant and different borderlands can be opened, and quite possibly some generalizations, both small and large, might be admitted into border theory. My paper marks an attempt to both advance African border theory at the ethnological level and to link border studies in Africa with the established and critical heartland of border studies in the American Southwest. Okay, and just the lost a few words here. Matunsky and, sorry, wait a minute. Okay, just to finish this section of the paper, and I have some other materials. The time is, of course, to reference the Komarov's not that new, but new-ish book, Theory from the South, and that in some ways these kinds of administrative vectors, these kinds of principles of management have crept north as the African border has crept north, and the ways of doing things in Africa have become more characteristic of what goes on in Italy and Spain or in Eastern Europe than Europe's border regimes have become characteristic of Africa, and that in looking for border theory, maybe we should start to look at the sending countries in the south more than the north. Now, it's very controversial kind of theory. It's not clear, because I don't know if Jean and John anticipated the severity, I mean the brutality of the reaction to from southern members of the EU on the southern periphery of the organization. Their response that we're seeing now doubled and redoubled, which has even played in, of course, to the populism that has swept up in America, and forms of nationalism that we really thought the end of the Second World War had put to bed. Maybe we were, I don't know, fingers crossed. We thought that fascism or something had kind of died with the, no. And interestingly, of course, it's the former state socialist European members who are most draconian and most dismissive of liberal kinds of democratic values on which the EU has based its border regimes and its migration regimes and so on. And it's funny, the leading democratic leader of the world and the leading democratic country in the world is Germany. Okay? Was it number 2, Japan? The ironies of this, but, and it doesn't look like Merkel's going to get away with it. You know, it seems as if with her side, which is, you know, let's deal directly with the impact of the migrants as a human movement and face the fact that these are not just packages that can be, you know, tossed back in. Oh, that's not popular. That's costing her votes. That's a big problem. So I don't know whether the Comoros really anticipated that how strident and how strong that reaction would be. But I think maybe even most of us here even are kind of reeling from the news that we receive about these things. I have a little bit of further material on the externalization of borders. Should I kind of go through that? You know? Just to say, to make 2 broad points, because I'd love to really have a discussion with you people and learn things. I'm getting older, I'm getting out of date, I want to learn, and I can't always travel the way that I used to. The one aspect that came to me myself, doing my border studies, was what I call the dyadic relation, in that whatever you say about rules and laws and regimes and fences and parliaments and armies, and the border encounter is an encounter between a migrant or some migrants and some beleaguered officials of some kind right there. And so many people, you know, I've interviewed who they managed somehow to make it from Iran to Sweden, or they managed somehow to make it from Syria to Finland or something, and you think, how did this person do it? And somewhere along the line, after 10 ratty fake passports and fake invitation letters from women's gender advancement consortia to our friend Aliyah, so on, from heaven knows where, a border official looks at the person, knows that really they're not there to do any harm and they have nowhere to go, and they turn the page and they stamp it and they said, go. And I have seen this. Okay. And in one case, I actually argued at the Finnish border. I had full permission to go through because I'm a great big white man with all sorts of university da-da-da-da-da-da, okay, and a bad attitude, you know. My advice in Europe, if you want to cross the border, have a bad attitude. No humility, no, oh, sir, no. I'm Professor David Coplan, you will just kind of thing, and I have my papers, I've got and why we have this, and so on. Unlike Africans, see, the African border people are like humble, be humble, be recognized. Chief, like, please, like this, and I'm only that, and, you know, you, if only, and he feels, okay. Not in Europe. In Europe, it's like, what are you trying to get away with? What's all this humility? They don't trust humble people. They don't trust people who, you know, oh, yes, sir. No, 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 no. You better boss them around and show that you can, you know, because you must be important. If you have the cojones to abuse them, oh, they think you're somebody. Okay.
So what works for getting into the U.S.?
Nothing. The U.S. is a tough one, let me tell you something. The U.S. stuff. Later on we'll talk about these things. I've had my own problems getting into my own country. You know, what are you doing here? Well, I have a passport, but it seems like you live in South Africa a lot of the time. Yes, I do, but, you know, I was born and raised, and so what are you doing here now? Looking for a job, are you? It's kind of and the other thing, I'm wasting time, but our Hispanic compatriots, Mexican and other Latin nationalities, who are in uniform at our southern borders, are no joke towards their own compadres, their own, you know, the others. I've never, you know, they are really, they weren't that tough on me. They were sure tough on the Spanish speakers in the line, because I guess they're in and you're not. I don't know what it is exactly, but, and then the Mexican person will say, but La Raza, Mexicano, you know, we are brothers and sisters, can't you? Are you kidding? No. So I would say it's very hard to get into our blessed country. And getting harder. Nevertheless, as an American citizen, I have managed it, barely. Okay. Otherwise, so what I'm saying is, I'm a performance studies scholar person, actually, my other side. And I saw performativity at the borders and all the borders every time I would go there, how the migrant performs, how the border guard wants to perform, who gets to feel like the boss and who doesn't, and who's doing. No matter how many rules and laws and regulations there are, even at the American one, there's a way to. One of my problems was I went to Mexico by trolley. I was at UCSD in La Jolla in California as a visiting on a sabbatical, and I didn't bother to buy a car because there's very good public transportation in the San Diego area. I didn't buy a car. So I decided I'll take a tour of Mexico one weekend, and I went by trolley to the McDonald's, which is the border. The border post with San Isidro, the busiest border post in the world, is a McDonald's. Okay? So you get there, and you walk through a turnstile into Mexico, nobody looks at you. Zip, you walk through a turnstile. Coming back, coming back, coming back. Okay, I took a bus along the border. It was fascinating. We saw what's there after a day or two. And I came through at Mexicali. And the lady there said, well, where's your car? And I said, well, you know, I'm at UCSD. What do you do at UCSD? Well, I'm a professor. You're a professor? Where's your car? I said, no, you see, I just thought I'd have a weekend, and I'm an anthropologist. I said, I could travel with the people. You know, I'm a common, that's what, you know, because anthropology, we travel with the people. And she was so suspicious and blonde. It just, you know, how could a full professor from the University of California, who's not at the San Isidro border post anyway, but it's somewhere down, not have a car. It just, anyway, she gave me a really, really bad look, but she let me through because, you know, my passport was there. And needless to say, I didn't wag my finger or say, you know, you really have no right to, no. I said, it's cool, it's all right. I really am. Anyway, so the diet. Secondly is the externalization of borders, which I'll finish with. Europe has gone through enormous efforts to try to put the border to Europe in Dhaka and in Bangui and in Nairobi and in so much so that, I mean, there's two vectors or two strategies. One is to actually go to the consulate and try to get an actual visa through various kinds of weeks of this, that, and the other. And the other is to access the very large industry of get you across the border people who have all sorts of stories, and they're what I call these hierarchies of claims based on supposed hierarchies of connection and knowledge. I know somebody in the ministry. My brother works at the American Embassy. We have trucks that go across after midnight, and you don't know if it's the case. Are you going to take a chance with one of these and then be caught in the middle of something, and then out comes every dollar you have just to save yourself from being killed, or what? Or are you going to be sent back? And again, so these claims will be made, and there's plenty of people making the claims. And are some of them in cahoots with the people inside the consulate? Oh, yes, they are. Don't believe that it's all, once you've entered Europe and it's rational, bureaucratic, uncorrupt, God save the Queen bureaucracy the minute you're on the grounds of the consulate. No, everybody's got something going, so it's a big business. And that's where the borders are, except for those who, you know, take the chance and get in a truck and go through the Sahara, and they end up, well, I'm sure some involved in this field, you know that you end up in every terrible place between this, you know, Naime and the water. But I was just to conclude our discussion was, there's a caravan, they call it. Sounds African, doesn't it? It sounds like the Sahara. There's a caravan right now at the southern border of Mexico that is coming into Mexico, and it's heading for your door, for East Lansing, Michigan. It's heading right for you. And there was, this morning it said in the paper, they have realized that there's a critical mass, and because they are so many of them, the Mexicans can't stop them. Well, how much do the Mexicans want to stop them? What's in it for them? If they get to San Isidro, what's the big plus for the Mexicans in persecuting these people and cracking down? And I don't know. But apparently there's a big deal on the Arizona side and the California side about what will be done. So watch that space. How many days before the camel caravan from Timbuktu, Honduras, arrives? I'm supposed to be a social scientist. I'm not sure what's going on. But thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Coplan, for that take on African borders and borders beyond. We're going to open the floor here in just a second for questions. And again, we will ask people to please use the microphone, not for internal amplification, but for those who are following on the video and the live stream and things like that. So we'll pass this around. Before we get that, however, as a new introducer, I managed to fail in half of my duties, which is to announce upcoming events. So since we have Dave Newman-Glavsky here sitting to my left, next week at this time in this venue, Dave will be presenting on Fleeing Violence by Following Family, the Full Bay of Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, 1960 to 1978. So please come by on Thursday, November 1st for that. and also being sponsored by the African Studies Center, the Year of Global Africa, and the MSU Libraries on October 26th, which is tomorrow, from 1 to 4 p.m. On the second floor west in the main instruction room, will be African Women in History, a Wikipedia Edit-a-thon. So you can make a public contribution to doing better with the history of Africa than Wikipedia does at the moment, which I can assure you is fairly terrible.
Even though we all quote it.
Even though, that's why we want to go tomorrow so we can quote properly.
Yes, right, yeah.
So let's open the floor at this time for some questions. We'll take a couple questions perhaps, and then let David respond. So. The microphone movers. Thank you. And please introduce yourself too.
Okay, my name is Jose Arturo Saavedra, and now I'm visiting scholar in the African Studies Center. I'm from Mexico. In Mexico, we have African studies as well. Not very strong like here, but I'm trying to get the force and the enthusiasm of this place here. Okay, I have a little bit comment and a question. The comment is in regard of the idea of talking about border studies in Africa. I understand that there are people who do that in a sociologist and anthropologist way. But in the case of Africa, my first feeling is that when you talk to border studies, you again come back to the idea that Africa is an unitary thing without any difference. That all the borders that you find in Africa, nevertheless, the history, the colonial history, or who were the colonial powers, is the same problems or the same characteristics. I'm not so sure in that sense. So in that sense, my first question it will be, what is the scope, the general goal, the target of doing this kind of study or research or focus in the idea that probably you try to find similar problems in similar areas of Africa. Probably that's the point. But I wonder if it's not interesting to try to deal general, if you make that approach so unitary of the continent. It's not interesting that, or someone probably has done, try to focus on problems that are similar because the colonial history. For example, to wonder, in Africa, there's many secessionist situations. Historical, let's think Nigeria. Let's think Sudan, South Sudan. Let's think now about the case of Angola with Cabinda. Let's think now about Cameroon. That is a very interesting story, because you know that one area that was in certain moment part of the British Nigeria territory, now they try to separate of Cameroon. And with the criteria, the language, but not an ethnical language, English versus French. It's very interesting because we're talking about repositioning the borders because of the areas, because of the situation of areas. And my other question, it will be, I didn't understand if you or another author are making comparisons with Mexican-American border and I don't know, South African, which other, or South African borders in general. I will let you know more about that, and if you or another author has done that. Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, need to kind of apologize because I was coming to give just a single talk all the way to America. I thought, well, should I come and just talk about one border, which is what you should do. You can make a very good case that they are not comparable at all. And of course that Mexico, US, and whichever border in Africa are not comparable at all. But since I was coming this far, I thought I would try to pull out some generalities strongly, which apply less and more here and there in order to just create interest in the group here at MSU and to think about these issues at all. Because I was afraid, well, I'll come and I'll say, down in Lesotho we do this. And everyone will say, oh, that was Lesotho, that was interesting. What's for lunch? So you come this far and you start to think, well, African border studies, is there anything I can pull out, you know, of intellectual points that might even interest you if you were studying the Southwest American and North west borders of Mexico? And I've even written a paper, which is quite a crazy paper, I admit, about some similarities of Lesotho, South Africa, and Mexico. And it's not that I wanted to prove something, but just to create the sense that Africa can contribute to border theory. And so whenever you do more general things, you violate the specific, always. You know, you take Mahmoud Mamdani, you know, the Citizen and Subject, when that came out, he came to Wits and the Citizen and Subject, and everybody said, but in my neck of the woods, this shit, this what, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, Mahmoud is a very strong personality. And he was angry as well, you know, because, well, of course, in my neck of the woods, there's this, that, and the other that was different. But Mahmoud was after something that we could chew on in the larger. And anytime you advance some general ideas in theory, you're going to do, you will violate exactly the way that you are suggesting. So I really only came to have some things to discuss. But absolutely, you can go to any border and you'll find another kind of dimension to what is happening. Nevertheless, one could say that, you know, the externalization of Europe's borders to African capitals and so on, it's happening in a lot of places via the whole, and the problem of the EU and EU lack of coordination with the whole thing, and the people of all the different countries who are dying, whether in these camps or in the water and so on. So I take your point. But I felt in coming all the way from Joburg, maybe I should put some general things on the table, then say, well, when I was in Lesotho,
Mike has moved over here.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm actually giving this talk next week, also on borders, but a particular border. So if you want to come to that.
little border.
But I have two questions. The first one is about, I guess it's more of an opinion question, but you know, you talked about how people in the border regions see the borders differently than national governments see it. And so do you think there's a sort of vision there for some sort of shared governance or some sort of border management that doesn't come from Dakar or Banjul or, you know, capital cities? And the second question is, what about internal borders, like within African countries, if you could speak to that?
There's a whole nother one. If, you know, of course, it's show me the money. The problem is show me the money. The border's a business for local people. On the other hand, you know, there's these inspectors and officials who are always coming by and wondering why their cut didn't reach the regional headquarters, because in the regional headquarters, Pretoria is asking where their piece of the... So it's... And people on the border tend to want to run their own affairs because that's where the business is. That's how it functions. So in order... This sounds all very cynical, but look at it. The business part of it, the rake-off that might go to the capital, tends to be resources withdrawn from the local area, and the locals would just as soon keep that business going for themselves. So they'll make a law. No 6 months pass without going through this line with the other thing and the bump, and you have to go on and on. So now it costs twice as much to get a 6 months pass. Well, the guys on the border are not in favor of that because everybody's doing business with the 6 month pass and and everything, and so there's one law. Let's take South Africa. There's one law in Pretoria, and there's another law down in the border, and the people in the central government are always, they're getting around us again. In the sense that there's always this kind of thing. But borderlanders are usually the same language and ethnic group as the people just on the other side of the border. They are not necessarily speaking the same language as the people in Pretoria. So on the Lesotho border, everybody's Basotho, everybody. And they're all related, and they all have very good reasons to have a fairly open border. But in Pretoria, it's a whole nother crowd of vultures who this and this and this and this and this, and I could go on in the stories about the efforts of the central government to send controllers down there and make the Basotho behave, and how happy the Basotho are to see them, and all this kind of thing. So yes, I mean, if Luo and Kikuyu in Kenya, all sorts of places. And just to finish up, going too long, in Johannesburg, there is a police unit at police main headquarters called the Border Police. That's what they're called. And there ain't no border for about 200 kilometers at the very nearest. What border are they guarding? They're guarding the border of Johannesburg, where there are countless numbers of undocumented people from the place. And it's a shakedown. Police don't mind if you don't have papers. They will look upon you kindly for a certain consideration. They've been known to show a certain disappointment in people whose papers are together. And they've done the right, this you know, kind of thing, you know. Because if you poor soul don't have your papers in order, well, that's terrible. But I don't know if that answers your question.
So thank you for the talk. If your goal is to stimulate thinking, I can't stop thinking about, I can't keep track of all of the thoughts I have. And I think it's because anyone who's traveled has got to have border stories about the good and the bad. And so I'm going to I'll try and quickly run through just one or two and then get to a question I have. I too crossed the border from San Diego south with Bob Cancel. Maybe you met when you were in UCSD. He took care of the ASA conference there a few years ago.
I know Bob from when I was there.
And we had to have a break afterwards in Mexico. So Bob put me in his car and we headed south into Mexico to have a good time. The car never stopped moving at the border. As you talked about going through. We came back, there must have been 20 lanes of cars lined up like an hour or two for each lane. I mean, that is the most visual and conceptual difference in the border I've ever seen anywhere. And it's for obvious, all those obvious reasons. So it's like your story that you gave on that
I did
border.
that on foot when I didn't have the car.
You didn't
Walked through to Mexico, spent hours in the sun with the Mexicans trying to walk back in
Yeah.
to my own country.
Right. Yeah. So in the same stories we'll have, for any border, I think we'll have similar kinds of comments like that. I crossed the border from Cameroon to Chad and Central African Empire, I think at the time, and there was no one there. So, I mean, so the conditions of borders can be radically different. I had a couple of thoughts. Things that you didn't mention in the talk, just to throw them out. Although you talk about Lesotho on both sides of the border and having a commonality, my experience of borders, not just in Africa, but in Europe, wherever I've been, is that in fact there are language differences in the border. But I don't mean right in the border, I mean around the border. And I'll give as an example, if you're on the southern border of France and Spain, the Spanish comes in, and the Spanish, in fact, crosses over into Morocco. So northern Morocco, now you've got the border for language is different from the kinds of border which is policed as you're describing it. And that kind of melding and mixing of languages in the border area is something fascinating. So when you had that response, they speak French over there in Senegal and English over here in Gambia. That's actually a meaningful difference. They may be sharing of some languages, but others, those differences are extremely important. And also in Cameroon, the Anglo-Franco difference borders are of major importance. So the language is one issue that maybe one can think about, but the other is the placement of the border, the thing you begin with. The way many of us have experienced borders is, in fact, arriving in airports. And that experience, I'm not sure corresponds. I'm trying to make a correspondence between what you were saying about borders in all those other locations. But in airports, it feels to me that a community of people who live on the border, or profit from the border, who have language shared, and we don't have that so much in airports. And yet that's the border that most of us, well, many people, many people confront in their lives. And I wonder what your reflections might be on that.
Should we take one more and maybe combine a couple of these?
Whatever you say.
Yeah, let's take a couple more questions and then we can.
My name's Eric Schneiderman. I'm just a local resident. One of the things that occurs is that almost all of the countries of Europe have terrible looming demographic problems where they will have a very drastic shortage of younger people to do things. You know, they may be unemployed now, but the population trends are just inexorable. It's going to happen. Do you see any signs at all that leadership, whatever that means, really are thinking about ways to facilitate immigration, or at least not, or at least prevent things that will hamper it permanently, because they surely are going to need people, probably from the south, and probably sooner rather than later.
Yes, should I go
Yeah,
sooner
go
with
for
him? Yes, you're quite right. Airports are a different thing. And I was covering land borders, which for African people specifically may loom larger than the airport per se. But the airport's got its own border culture and things that are expected and things that are done and the way people relate. And there is some literature on it. One person who's done wonderful work is Brenda Chalfin at Florida, who's worked on Accra's airport, Kotakaz airport, and studied the border officials like it's a village, you know, and how they do and so on, and some great stories. But they have a big complaint. Their big complaint is that visitors maybe from Europe or the Americas tend to go with a program as written on the poster on the wall, and Africans won't. They're always saying, "Oh, but Aura, my friend, we know this. I know it's a debate, you know. But on the other hand, and I have this, you know, and my and somebody like you will say, yes, I bought this briefcase, and you know, and this, yes, it's blah, and I'll sign and I'll do the customs, what, and you know, and you'll try to be as much as you can, you know, no problem. Oh, the endless. I mean, all you have to do is get yourself behind a Ghanaian who's got a problem and thinks that being Ghanaian, they're entitled to a little bit of consideration here. You might as well go to sleep because it's going to be a very long time. I think, you know, there's a bit of a special. So even there is a kind of a division between the very foreign or visitor who feels, I'm really on strange ground here. I'm hoping that the airline will rescue me. I got rescued once by Iberia Airlines, who hauled me out of Congolese detention, saying, "This is our passenger, and he's paid for his ticket, and he's coming with us." Okay. Because there was some disease that I supposedly didn't have a shot for or something, and and the lady from Iberia felt so bad for me, she pulled rank. But anyway, the Ghanaians, they feel they're, you know, entitled to, I'm bringing a grand piano and a Mercedes, and, you know, I told you I would, so what's the problem? And, you know, and the other question of, yes, they know this, but human nature. Merkel's policy was based on this idea at first and Macron, that, well, we need all these Syrians or whatever people because they can work and make BMWs and do all these things. And then lo and behold, difference raises its ugly head, because Germany has been in the longue durée of history rather German. They have a Unitarian notion of Nation ist Blut. I mean, if you live in Germany, Germany is supposed to be German. And they thought, well, what we'll do is we'll make Germans out of the Syrians and Turks. That was the actual plan. We'll have afternoon teas, and the Turks and the Syrians will all have to learn how to speak German, and they'll go to. Well, it wasn't as easy to get the Turks, for example, to stop being Turkish as they thought. On the contrary, there was some intimation that maybe the Germans ought to learn a little bit about Turkish. Beyond wonderful cheese and olives and doner kebabs, that they should actually, consider the Turkish population as, well, that didn't suit the Germans one little bit. So there's this problem that Europe has a lot of kings and queens. Have you noticed they still got a lot of kings and queens in Europe? And a sense of nationality which is, in their mind, quasi-genetic or something. And now confronted with people who, lo and behold, now appear to them to be unassimilable. And all it took was a mini crime wave in Cologne or in Stockholm, if you know about this, that suddenly it's them gonna rape our women, them, and So you've seen, I think Sweden has just, among others, elected or is going to elect a very right-wing government, and Italy and Austria and Hungary, and all of which is based on a ride to power on the backs of these people are not assimilable, they should work and go home to their homeland, or they should be Gastarbeiters, really, they can't be German, France does the best, funny enough, and I'll stick my neck out, end of the question. Who does best at assimilating people in this situation? And the answer is the United States of America. Assimilating.
The Japanese seem to be, the light's finally going on.
Ooh,
They're the worst, but they're.
but being Japanese is a religion.
No. They got-
Actually, the border to American culture is not national.
Yes, it's a. I don't know what it is. It's not. It's not a genetic because
There's no country without that.
I mean, you can't become Japanese if you're not.
I have a question that kind of follows up on that, and it's kind of a bigger conceptual question. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about on sort of the relationship. I'm really interested in this idea of sort of the tug of war between the interior, the central, or the capital city, and the economic activity that's going on in the borderland. And I guess I'm interested in, obviously, we've started to talk about xenophobia or nativism or anti-immigrant sentiment, whatever you want. I mean, we've talked about Europe, we've talked about the United States, and South Africa too. I mean, we're gearing up in the elections next year. The DA has taken a very hard line against foreign nationals. I saw an article on News 24 yesterday that talked about this party. People want the IEC to deregister because it calls for expelling all foreign nationals from the country. So this is not a problem that's confined to what was formerly known as the First World. But I'm interested in kind of this complicated relationship between, I guess, sort of internal economic integration, or even just sort of economic prosperity in general, and xenophobic sentiment, right? So the European Union is a perfect example, kind of this area where internal borders have been greatly, greatly reduced, and regional integration has been greatly improved, at the same time now facing this incredible backlash to, outside the Union, people coming in. Even in the United States, I mean, I'm thinking back in the 19th century, originally you had this very decentralized system where there was any kind of immigration enforcement. It was on a state-by-state basis. Through the early 20th century, the federal government takes more and more of that, and eventually you got the act in 1924 that established the quota system and almost shut off the taps. at the same time, all this xenophobic sentiment in America right now is happening at a time when economic growth is, going full bore. Unemployment is at incredibly low levels. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
All of that, or some of
Yeah.
it, or part of it, or what they go to. When I made the remark about, the United States, it's just that the people who came through Ellis Island, which include my folks, aren't doing as well as they imagine they always should these days. And it's they, of course, who are most have a problem about Mexican people coming to the, whereas everybody else knows that California's economy will collapse without, the migrants. And just to finish that, most ironically of all, when there was the first NAFTA thing, the first time we had NAFTA, and there were these people saying, I hear a great sucking sound of American jobs, heading for Mexico. Okay, some Americans did lose their jobs in the NAFTA changeover, and almost all of those were Mexican Americans. I mean, American citizens of Mexican descent disproportionately lost jobs in the NAFTA because we just shoved them south of the border. So the people who, and those are not the Trump voters didn't lose jobs to NAFTA, particularly up in where you are here. So you never know. I mean, all these things are going on, and we sit and hope that maybe history will somehow supersede all this. And I certainly don't have a solution, for you. But in the case of South Africa, the cynicism, the DAs thing that you mentioned, is just to get votes. They were the big globalizers. It was, what can I say, gospel that the white population of South Africa didn't care about African immigrants coming in. Xenophobia was confined to black people. Never meet a white people say, oh, them Zimbabweans. It's always black people say, because, damn, we didn't take this country from the white people to give it to the Zimmers. Jesus, Whereas white people go, oh, hey, a cheap gardener. Cool. So we can reduce, I don't care. So the social exclusion, black South Africans who feel dispossessed, employment is at 37% and this and this and this. There's a tremendous desire to exclude somebody. And interestingly enough, they don't try to exclude people like me because the assumption is that I somehow bring something up. We don't know who he is, but he's a white guy, and he seems to be professional, and he's probably bringing, he even creates employment. Who knows? I mean, maybe I can work in something for him. But if they see an unemployed or whatever, they see some guy from somewhere, they say, we're coming to take my job. Dave Coplan has a job, but now there's some Zimmer doing it, not me, okay, or something like that. It's true, actually. Our domestic helper is Basotho from Lesotho, right? Who speaks only Sesotho. No English. And the reason is, please forgive me. The reason for this is my wife rules the household, and she is a Basotho. And she'll be damned if she's going to hire one of these unknown township, South African, or whatever, unemployed, God knows what. Oh no, she goes back to her friends in the village and says, any of the girls don't have a job, that might, because we need, an accountable person from a known family with needs known to us that we will see them at Christmas, kind of. Now, this does have the effect that we feel the person is well integrated into our household and so on, and that she won't run away and get up to stuff and invite in the thugs with her keys because she's us. Oh, my wife will not have a stranger in the house. All right. And what can I say? So there are these kinds of things, but now the DA, which was supposed to be the global, they see that a lot of black South Africans who are maybe more conservative really than what the ANC would like to imagine, if they propose a little bit of anti-immigrant stuff, they're going to get votes, and that's what it's all about. And I am furious. That party, either you are the the globalizing liberal capitalists, open up the doors, or you're those populist deadheads. Not both. However, don't get me started. What does it say, Mr. Saturday Night? Don't get me started.
My question's two-pronged. When you think about borders, and we talked about the border of the airport as well, and specifically flying into Cape Town, and you also talked a little bit about performance. If you've ever gone through Cape Town as a brown person and seen the performance of trying to get through the airport, holding people back to go through their luggage, and it's a performance of you're not welcomed here.
Right, yes.
Into Cape Town. You're not welcome. And you can see the long lines of Africans, and particularly they're trying to listen to your accent or what have you. But there's this performance going on, which is quite interesting. I want you, if you can, to talk a little bit about that. But also, it kind of goes back to your argument about whites not caring about Africans being in their spaces. In Cape Town, it seems like this is perhaps the last lager, the last bastion of whiteness. And with that, this kind of you're not welcome in Cape Town starts right there at the airport.
Absolutely.
Seems kind of quite interesting to me.
Yes, that's our little deepest south of all the south. That's the deepest south you're going to get. Yes and no. It's absolutely true. Although the lager, which you so appropriately call it, is actually a brown-skinned lager in the sense that the majority of the population of Cape Town is of mixed descent. The term colored is sort of used. And they're all worried about all these black Africans coming to their cozy Cape Town thingy where they've got a deal going. Culturally, they are closer to the white population in the two languages that they speak, Afrikaans and English. The people we call colored do not speak African languages. They speak the white languages of Afrikaans, and there's a kind of partnership there between the ruling white elite that was colonial, and then now the client group, the colored, this sounds horrible, forgive me for all this racist claptrap, but that's the way it, who are now cool with, we and the whites can make a kind of a thing, and then the real black Africans, we have too many of them, there's too many of them, they might even outvote us or something. So it's become this place where, if it was up to the Cape Townian, there would be a border at Beaufort West where people from the northern part of South Africa would have to show their Cape passports. The Western Cape would like to have a Cape passport. And if you're really black, you have to show your Cape passport to get, otherwise, get out. And of course, the big enemy is not even people from other African countries or gentlemen like yourself, but the Xhosa, who are a huge nation just down the road, and they've always been around Cape Town, and they don't need a Cape passport, and at least you got to stop, you don't have a South African thing. The Xhosas are come, they are South African, so they're in a panic in Cape Town, and I know it's a beautiful city. It's the least changed from the old days of any of our cities. And I don't mean to pound on them, but I taught at UCT for some time when I first came, and I decided to go up to Johannesburg and be at Wits University, because I said, at least here we're all in the ring together. It's like, doesn't matter, you put on the gloves and get in there. Whereas in Cape Town, certain people have a horseshoe in their glove or something, or they, I don't know, fingers on the scale, something like that. Cape Town will only change. It's an international city in terms of real estate, with some of its most valuable properties are actually owned by foreign money and so on. And the big developments you see in Cape Town where things are built is money from outside the city. So not to go on and on, but just to remember that South Africa is not Antarctica like I joked, right? When people talk about, oh, the whites have all the land, and yes, now which whites are these? These are whites based in corporations in London and Minnesota and Canada. I mean, some of the farms in South Africa where you talk about, well, it's a white farm. It's a huge agribusiness corporation with multiple stockholders from... South Africa is a huge agricultural producer. It's one of our big industries. And we produce for the EU, which is not easy because if the banana is curved more, kind of is that. There are 5,000 farms in South Africa that produce 80% of all of our food. Out of tens of thousands and thousands and thousands of farms, 5,000 farms are 8%. Well, those aren't owned by your farmer brown or white. You know, yes, there are some very large farmers who began in South Africa and grew and multiplied, but there are also a great many owned by the Australian wheat, Monsanto, and it's not easy. When I talk about land reform, a multi-billion-dollar corporation which maybe is not so cooperative as farmer white or farmer brown. It's a lot easier to, if a white farmer has a farm to go buy that farm and to buy out Monsanto. So, and the Cape is very much like that. Gigantic wine farms with international shipping and profile. The wine business, multi-billion. And you're really up against it. But I agree with you totally that it's a shame, and it makes you hang your head. You go to Cape Town Airport and see that, you know, perfectly reasonable, professional, and honest people are made to take off all their clothes, you know, strip naked, while I walk around like, and I'm not even born in South Africa. You know, I'm not born in South Africa. I have a free ticket. Nobody in my whole experience in that whole country has ever said, "What are you doing here, white boy?" Never. I do have the advantage. I can speak one of the languages, Sesotho. I can speak Sesotho. So if somebody who doesn't like foreigners talks to me, I can reply to him in his own language. And then he knows that I must be local, because who in the world speaks Sesotho except a South African? I can even walk through the border without a passport if I can speak Sesotho. Because where the hell else would I be from? But I'm not, actually. So I'm sorry you had that experience, and the next time give me a call, and I'll put you in touch with some people down there, and you'll be far better treated, I hope.
It's like that in Gatwick as well.
Yeah. Oh, Britain. Oh, God.
Every time we come through Gatwick, we pull over people off the lines, people of color, every single time.
And they especially hate South Africans. Especially. Because we're little criminals. And people go to Lesotho and get in Lesotho they get a British visa for $5. And they really are Al-Qaeda, but, you know.
All right, I think we'll finish up. Dr.
Yeah.
Coplan, thank you so much
Yeah.
for being here today, for a really great conversation and great
Thanks everyone
talk.
for coming.
Thank you. So we'll see everybody next week.